Hello, this is Dennis Hancock, Extension Forage Specialist with the University of Georgia. This is the first part in a three-part series on Bermudagrass management for improved production and stand maintenance. In this series, what we'd like to cover is an overview of Bermudagrass forage production, variety selection, establishment and grow-in, the fertilization needs both for production but also for stand maintenance. Then I'd also like to spend some time talking about nitrate accumulation in Bermudagrass and strategies that we can take to avoid that. Then I'd also like to visit with you on harvesting methods and how that influences stand maintenance, the effects of extended grazing and how that also affects stand maintenance. Then also the final topic will be on burning Bermudagrass in the spring of the year and how that influences production and stand maintenance. Bermudagrass is a very common forage that we have around in the southeast. It was actually introduced in Georgia. The seeded varieties are the most widespread, the common variety, of course, being the most common, as the name would imply. But there are other improved seeded varieties out there, most of which have their origins in the turfgrass industry. However, many of them make excellent forage crops. There are a number of sprig varieties out there as well that are vegetatively propagated. These are usually hybrids. A widespread breeding effort has gone on with these hybrid Bermudagrasses, especially here in Tifton at the USDA-ARS program in conjunction with the University of Georgia. A large number have also been released from the program in Oklahoma. Bermudagrass is typically very drought tolerant as well, which makes it ideally suited for periods of drought that we typically have in the southeast during the summertime. It is also very aggressive and can be very persistent if we treat it correctly and maintain in attempts to maintain the stand. Now, the persistence really, in many ways, is keyed into the requirements of high fertility that Bermudagrass has. If we look at nutrient removal by the different forage grasses in the south, and looking at the three primary ones of Bahia grass, Bermudagrass, and tall fescue, we can see some differences that occur here between these different species and how much they remove from the ground per year. Note that Bermudagrass requires a tremendous amount of nitrogen, but also a tremendous amount of potassium. Tall fescue is very similar. In fact, it actually requires even more potassium. The phosphorus requirements for each of these are relatively low, as are the calcium and magnesium requirements, but all of those macronutrients are critically important. So when selecting a Bermudagrass variety, it's important first to make sure that we are selecting those that are agronomically acceptable. First off, we're talking about being tolerant of the climatic conditions of the region we're in. And also, they need to be able to produce the highest possible yields of high quality forage. A good example of this is Tifton 85 Bermudagrass. Tifton 85 is probably the highest quality and highest yielding Bermudagrass that we have available to us. However, it has a limited climatic zone which it is reasonable for it to be grown. We generally draw that line at about Interstate 20. Anything above that becomes a little bit more risky to grow Tifton 85. It can do very well up in places much further north than that, but there is always a risk of winter kill with some of these varieties, and Tifton 85 is one of those. We actually had it in Calhoun in the northwest corner of the state in trials there and did very, very well. However, I will note that this is a 3-year study. This was not carried on for a longer period of time. And during each of these 3 years, we really never had a severe winter. But notice that the yield differences there range quite a bit. Russell is the variety that we recommend for uh, the North Georgia area and performs very well in terms of yield per acre. Coastal Bermudagrass also does exceptionally well, although in this range you can see that it is lower than some of the other varieties that are recommended, such as Tifton 44. Although Alicia produces good yields, it is not acceptable variety in the north and in any parts of Georgia because of its susceptibility to leaf spot problems. By comparison, you can see some of the seeded Bermuda grass varieties. Now, this is on the same scale as you saw in the previous slide. And you can see a number of these seeded varieties can do very well, uh, somewhat close to what coastal Bermuda grass will produce. In Tifton, the story is a little bit different. This is actually the first 2 years of that same experiment. This time, this accentuates the difference, I guess, in the grow-in of Tifton 85. Tifton 85 is a little bit slower to grow in. As a consequence, some of these more aggressive varieties tend to be a little bit better in terms of yield in those first 2 years. But over time, they begin to separate out a little bit more. And you can see that Tifton 85 gravitates to the top. Now, Coast Cross 2 is still an experimental variety. It has not yet been released. Just to point out also, the seeded Bermuda grasses here in red are going to be much, much lower in yield by comparison with the hybrid Bermuda grasses in the southern parts of the state. We also need to look at the soil fertility demands and the performance under irrigation, tying that back to the yields and the adaptation to the climatic conditions. But in addition to the agronomically acceptable areas, it also needs to be acceptable to the market which you're selling it to, or selling it through your animals. So if you have supreme quality demands, perhaps you're looking for a variety like Tifton 85 because it does have the highest digestibility and the highest quality overall. There may be other concerns as well: palatability, health concerns, either real or perceived. Certainly in the horse market, this is a primary concern because there are some rumors or innuendos about different forage varieties, different Bermuda grass varieties, as to whether or not they're palatable, whether or not they cause health problems in the animals. And really, there's no clear evidence that any one variety is more prone to these problems than others. Certainly, varieties do differ in yield, and we've talked about that already. But there are a number of other characteristics here that are important too. Certainly, quality, we've touched on that as well. There's a dramatic difference in quality between some of these species. Vigor, also a dramatic difference in some of these species and how vigorously they grow, especially during the grow-in phase. Another key difference is in how coarse these different species are, and that influences in many ways their drying rate. On the upper right-hand corner here, you see common Bermuda grass, relatively thin, very in contrast to Tifton 85, which is below it here. Tifton 85 is much more coarse. The common is much more fine in texture. More details about these different characteristics of individual species, individual varieties, can be found here in the Selecting a Forage Bermuda Grass Variety publication. In that publication, there is a table that summarizes this, although there's more detail in the text. This table does an excellent job of boiling this down into ratings on yield and what the expectations are relative, in this case, for example, relative to coastal. So anything that is greater than 100 is going to be basically better in yield than coastal. Then we also have ratings on digestibility, winter hardiness, persistence, and leaf spot resistance. Let's move on now to talk about establishment and grow in. So one of the best ways to establish Bermuda grass is in a prepared seed bed. A well-prepared seed bed is one where it has been plowed, disked, and finished at least 2 to 4 weeks prior to the sprigging operation. At that time, you can incorporate lime, phosphorus, and potassium as required by the soil test. This also should allow you time to allow that soil to settle or firm up prior to sprigging. If you don't have that time, you need to take the time to firm that soil with a cultipacker or roller. The seed bed should be very, very firm. Boot tracks should be no more than a 1/4 inch deep into that soil. And you can see an example of that here with my boot track in some soil on the right here. If the soil is too fluffy, the soil will dry very, very quickly, especially in sandy soils. So it's critically important that we get that seed bed to be very firm and ready for planting. Now there is also the minimum till, or sometimes called no-till, method of establishing Bermuda grass. And this is where the soil is really not prepared well in advance. It is actually planted with a no-till sprigger, or so-called no-till sprigger. There is a certain amount of tillage that is going on there. This is acceptable for sprigging Bermuda grass, at least in the Piedmont region. I think it has a little bit more difficulty in the sandier soils in South Georgia, but for the most part, this can work very, very well. No-till, or true no-till, really isn't appropriate for vegetative sprigging. It is best used when the terrain is rolling or soil is at risk of erosion, but it's only used for seeding Bermuda grass. In other words, not feasible for vegetative establishment or sprigging. So if you're seeding your Bermuda grasses using a seeded type, this is an acceptable practice, although still yet the prepared seed bed is going to end up giving you better, more uniform results than no-till. So what are some of the best methods for establishing seeded Bermuda grasses? Again, I think the best one is preparing a well-prepared seed bed and then planting with 5 to 8 pounds of whole seed per acre, usually in late spring to early July. It's better to do this earlier than later, and it's best to make all those seed bed preparations as early as possible. The strategy here is that we should be spraying in late winter, tilling and finishing the soil 2 weeks later after that herbicide has had time to act. Allow 2 weeks for the weeds to regrow and regerminate. Then till and finish again. Then that we can take that soil and firm it up with a cultipacker, and then we can plant either drilled or broadcast over the top. The no-till drill into a killed residue is a second best option. I really consider that to be a distant second to a well-prepared seed bed. But in this instance, we can apply 7 to 8 pounds of whole seed per acre in late spring to early July into that killed residue and have some reasonably good success in doing this. So what are some of the best methods for establishing hybrid Bermuda grass? Well, in my opinion, one of the best ways to do this is with dormant sprigs, rhizomes that are sprigged in late December to early March, preferably in the February to March time frame throughout most of Georgia. This is done at a rate of 40 to 50 bushels of sprigs per acre. Sprigging with green tops, or sprigging with normal sprigs, what most folks consider the sprigging operation, can be done after the last freeze in the spring and then all the way up until early August. However, again, I want to emphasize that just because you can do it that late doesn't mean you should do it that late. Earlier is going to be better. 30 to 50 bushels per acre is the sprigging rate that should be used here. Then, a number of varieties can also be sprigged by tops or the green cuttings of stems from the top growth of other plantings. These should be sprigged at a rate of 50 to 60 bushels per acre, and this can again be done basically from June through August, but again, the earlier the better. However, some varieties cannot be sprigged by using tops. So, for example, Tifton 44 should not be sprigged using top. Again, all three of these methods are best if a well-prepared seed bed is prepared. Another important step, and this is critically important especially with some of our slower to establish varieties like Tifton 85, it is incredibly important to use a pre-emergent herbicide to control weeds. On the right hand, you see diuron, an application of diuron to some plots that we had near Griffin, Georgia. On the left-hand side is where no herbicide was applied. And what you see here on the left-hand side is actually goosegrass, not the Bermudagrass. On the right-hand side, you see the Bermudagrass, but not any of the goosegrass. It has suppressed the goosegrass from emerging. This is critically important because shade is a real enemy for grow-in of Bermudagrass. So what are some of the most common establishment mistakes? First is a failure to soil test, lime, and fertilize based on those soil test recommendations. Second is poor pest control, primarily poor weed control. Thirdly, many times we see poor soil preparations, poor seedbed preparations here. Then many times folks will plant too deep, or in some cases too shallow. Too deep and the sprigs have a hard time emerging. Too shallow and they dry out too quickly. Many times folks try to plant at the wrong time of the year or have uncooperative weather. And of course, there's not much that can be done about that. So that covers the overview of Bermudagrass forage production, variety selection, and establishment and grow-in. In the next part of this presentation, we'll talk more about fertilization needs for Bermudagrass. So with that, if you have any questions, I encourage you to check us out at the website, georgiaforages.com, or to call your county extension agent by dialing 1-800-ASK-UGA-1. By dialing that number, you will be connected with your county extension office from whatever county that you're calling from.